To start off Plague Week, we're going to start with one of the more requested Amazon builds for the upcoming patch 2.4, and that is the Poison Javelins. There's actually two approaches to this build that you can take, one that requires swapping weapons frequently and playing in a more twitchy style, and one that is more laid back and chill for farming while listening to podcasts. And those of you that know me know that this is going to be the second one. Another advantage of this chill setup though is that you do still have an entire weapon swap and lots of skill points to play with if you want to make a number of hybrid variants of this build, and there are several interesting options for that. The one we're going with today is the Lightning Poison Hybrid to make boss kills significantly quicker. This is due to how I initially set up the test runs. That said, stay tuned if you like Poison Javelin, since we will eventually get around to covering at least 5 other Poison Hybrid variants in the coming months, and possibly even their budget versions. Starting out, let's get those stats out of the way. As usual, enough strength and dexterity for gear and the rest into vitality. The reason we don't worry about block is that most things will be dead before they get to us, and those that aren't will be stuck on our Valkyrie and our Barbarian. The only time we really need to get in close range is, well, against bosses, and rarely against certain poison immune enemies, though I'd let the Barbarian handle the Stygians since they'll still wreck your face. The other reason we don't max block is because it would require far too much of our dexterity, and we need life for things like gloams. In terms of mercenary, I'm going with the Act 5 Barbarian setup with the Plague Runeword, and my usual Fortitude and Vampire's Gaze for just general use. Though the key things are the Resists and Leech here, so don't forget to, focus on those and don't be afraid to mix it up. The reason we use Plague though is because Infinity would only help our secondary damage source, and we don't need to lower enemy defense either to hit because, well, we're doing AoEs. Whereas Plague will drop enemy poison resist, while the Poison Nova can just fill in any gaps we have with our stronger poison application. And no, Nova will not override our personal poison, but our personal poison will override the Nova. As far as the core build, there's really only 3 necessary skills. One is Pierce to give us the chance of multiple clouds, though due to the Pierce bug still being there, don't always trust your eyes on this. 2, we have Plague Javelin for our main damage source of poison, and 3, it's Synergy Poison Javelin, which, despite showing well over 100,000 damage here, is actually far weaker than Plague due to the 84-second duration. The reason Plague Javelin is actually useful now is because of the 2.4 change that shortened Plague's duration down to 3 seconds, making it slightly longer than Necromancer's Poison Nova duration, but removing the need to wait literal minutes for the damage to finish delivering. And thanks to Poison being relatively easy to break, even with lower resist values, you don't have to worry about enemy immunities outside of a couple select areas, since it will get cast pretty often off of your aggressive Barbarian Mercenary. Now, a downside of all of this is that Poison is very mediocre against bosses, and there are still a few Poison immunes you won't be able to break, even with all the tools we have. So generally you're going to want to mix in a hybrid skill with this. For this variant, what I want to avoid swapping weapons on, we're going with Lightning, though not of the Fury variety, but rather Charge Strike for bosses, since it can stack all 10 of those charged bolts on one big boss body, chunking its life down quickly even with suboptimal lightning gear. And Lightning Strike is there for dealing with the handful of unbreakable poison immune enemies, since it really does decent crowd control and retained its synergies in 2.4. To bump these up the rest of the way, I invested any spare points into Lightning Bolt, since Fury no longer boosts either of the strike skills, and it's not terribly bad to use since we have 100% Pierce with our skills and gear combined, though I never really felt the need for it. It's there. Of course, before investing in this, we did make sure to get our 1-point wonders all the way up to Valkyrie in the passive tree, since the meat shield helps out a ton. That said, Lightning is only one of the options for hybrids on this build, since we have an entirely open weapon swap to mess around with for either pre-buffing or even an entirely different weapon set, so this is far from the only tool you can bring to bear. Though, speaking of gear, as stated, my goal for this was to not need weapon swaps. That way I can just chill and go through the game while watching streams or relaxing, rather than having to be in super tryhard mode, cycling skills and weapons every 2 to 3 seconds to maintain optimal damage. This means we need to consider less common gear, starting with the shield. In this case, I went with Headhunter's Glory since it's a decent shield with up to 3 open sockets, and I happen to have a spare one with those 3 open sockets. So I threw some of the mid-tier poison facets from our identification video into the sockets with a focus on minus resistances, since I'll be using this shield on other builds as well. This is the mid-price option, the cheap options being Moser's Circle with 2 sockets or a plain 4-socket Monarch with the facets in there, which is, yes, very expensive, but not as expensive as a good, well, Headhunter's Glory. The expensive end, the actual really expensive stuff, is Jeweler's Monarch of Deflecting or Jeweler's Monarch of the Colossus, with Deflecting being probably the one I'd go max block on if I was going to go max block on any of these. And yeah, the rest I don't need max block for PvE at all, but with PvP, if you're going to be trying this build with that, you will want to go for max block regardless of what shield you have, because otherwise you're going to get completely shredded. The other place that we pack in necessary minus enemy resist to overcome the basic general poison resistances of enemies, that is in our helmet. I went with one of the expensive options here with Crown of Ages again, because I'm going to use this helmet on the builds this week that I'm going to be, at least several of them. This is a lot of great mods for what we're doing, though options like Giant Skull or Jeweler's Circlets can get you some useful tools as well. The expensive option here would be really ungodly expensive with a Lancer's Circlet of Speed with a lucky 2-socket from Larza, because magic items can get 1 or 2 sockets from him, but that's extremely uncommon and expensive. Needless to say, more poison rainbow facets are generally the theme here. I like the 2 sockets with plus skills. You may like something else. Outside of that, most of what we use is not far from what you'd expect, with plus skills being a decent focus, with Mara's Kaleidoscope for the amulet since we need resist and I'm using my resist charms elsewhere, and Dual Stones of Jordan for mana bumps and extra plus skills, though you could swap one out for a Ravenfrost if you're wanting Cannot Be Frozen for the moments when you do need to go into melee. For extra poison damage, because we like big numbers, we're dropping in Bramble, which actually works well with our Mercenary and Valkyrie too, because they'll take the damage and like reflect it back at the enemies. And the 13 life per kill is fun to have since it does quite a bit of healing in crowds thanks to poison dropping things so quickly. This build can also use Enigma, though you do want to make some concessions for faster cast if you go that route, and the other big endgame option is Chains of Honor, and that's mostly if you really need those resists, though I didn't find them necessary. Jeweler's Armor with rainbow facets could be a thing here too, but I don't want to burn any more facets since I will need them for another build. Gloves are another source of extra poison damage though, with Trangul's Claws, which can be useful if you go the Enigma route since, well, you'll have faster cast on them, but here it's mostly just using them for resists and poison damage. With some hybrids you may need to ditch these for faster attack speed gloves, but for this setup it works just fine since we don't need to be spamming any of our skills to be actually effective. Belt wise, as you may have guessed from the earlier mention of 100% piercing, we are using Razor Tail, which stacks with our piercing skill to reach 100%. It also has some nice other mods that help us out like Dexterity and Damage Reflect, but they're not entirely necessary. One thing to note is this is to merely give us a chance of pierce, but you will notice that sometimes enemies will be standing in clouds from a second or third burst and not get poisoned. This is because the Javelin actually missed, and any pierce graphics are merely ghost hits. This happens with bows as well with the ice and fire arrows. This is a bug. You should be aiming to thread the needle for the middle of the pack. The pierce is just there for potential backup for a bad shot or an enemy taking a path you didn't expect. That leaves Javelins and Boots. Of course, we're going to be using Titan's Revenge. It gives us +4 to Plague Javelin, a chunk of stats, faster run walk, auto replenish. It's hands down one of the best Javelins for this type of build in the game. And generally, I wouldn't bother with the random magic options here because you're not going to get much of a benefit from most of the suffixes you can get from that. Though for Lightning Javelins, that is an entirely different story. So our gain here is minimal, but the magic ones can be good for other builds. The last piece of gear we equip is actually to make up for a gap in this build that some of you may have already noticed, and that's Silkweave. You may have noticed a conspicuous lack of mana recovery before this and wondered how we maintain our attacks. Well, these boots are how. Since the poison clears crowds quickly, these boots alone can recover our mana against most groups of enemies, with the only time we need to dip into mana potions being bosses or unbreakable poison immune packs. This combined with our life per kill basically gives us poor man's redemption without eating corpses, so it gets the Necro Buddy seal of approval. Charm-wise, it's just Harpoonist charms for maximizing damage, and the usual Torch and Annie if you have them. Then pack out the rest of your space for your resists or Magic Find or whatever you want. Though to sneak Magic Find into this build, I would actually sacrifice the rings first or even the helmet. It will slow you down a bit, but it'll work out fine in the long run. That said, this build is much better for rune hunting than magic finding, so keep that in mind, especially considering how easily it, like the Poison Necro, can absolutely destroy Travancore, as well as any kind of swarm areas like cows.